Alright, the RX 6600. This is the non-XT version, and the rest of the system is quite high-end. You can see right here that we're playing at 1080p on the highest quality settings, and it's hitting 60 FPS solid. And that was in combat as well. But you'll notice the GPU usage is not anywhere near 100%. We're hovering around halfway or so, depending on exactly what's going on the screen. Now, that brings us to the elephant in the room, and since you may or may not have watched my other videos where I discuss this, I need to explain this. If you set the frame rate higher than 60 FPS, well, actually it's any of these settings. These are all dynamic resolution scaling targets, and you cannot turn it off. Maybe in the ini file, I haven't explored that, but like in the game settings, this is terrible. So if I set, for example, 120 FPS target, there's a big problem. Now the game will run at 120 FPS. Look at that, great. The problem is that it's now having to do a dynamic resolution scale to try to stay at 120 FPS. So you may or may not be able to see it too badly in the YouTube video with compression and all that. But for example, I can tell that the light in front of me is a little bit pixelated around the edges because this is not running at a native 1080p. And notice it's also in this scene not able to actually hit 120 FPS. It's trying, and it's dynamically scaling down below 120 FPS. It's hitting below 1080p, and it's only hitting 110 FPS. So, to be clear, if I now actually change my frame rate target to, for example, 90 FPS, you'll notice that, well, I'm getting 90 FPS, and my GPU usage is still in the mid 90% range, and also some of those distant lights have slightly sharpened up the image, because now it's running closer to a native 1080p. The problem is that I still don't think it's exactly native 1080p. I think there's still a small amount of dynamic resolution scaling happening here to try to lock that 90 FPS. So I could then turn this down to 60 FPS like I was doing before, and now you'll notice that the GPU usage has dropped down into the 50, 60, 70% range. It kind of bounces around. But the point is, it's now able to actually hold native 1080p, and it's not fully working the GPU. The problem is there's no option to unlock the frame rate at a native resolution. The frame rate limit is also a dynamic resolution scaling target, and at this point there's no way to separate the two, which is really frustrating. We can see that 60 FPS is not fully utilizing the GPU, so we could do better. But like I said, at 90 FPS, I think there is a small amount of dynamic resolution scaling happening. However, I do believe that 90 FPS is going to be the sweet spot for 1080p on this GPU. The reason being, you're actually getting most of the performance that your GPU is capable of. Like, if, for example, in this scene, we're actually able to hit 90 FPS and the GPU usage isn't near 100%, meaning it's actually a native 1080p at 90 FPS right now. And it's only as we step out into more demanding scenes where a small amount of resolution scale seems to be used in order to maintain the 90 FPS. So I think that 90 FPS here is absolutely the sweet spot, and going up to 120 FPS involves more resolution scaling than I would like. I think it makes the image look a little bit softer than it should. So for me, 90 feels a lot better than 60 and takes more advantage of what the GPU is actually capable of. And so this is the way to go here on this GPU. All right.
Get him, boy.
Let's take a look at in combat and see how the 90 FPS holds. Keep an eye on the GPU usage, right? Anytime it kind of gets into the 90% range, there's a chance that we're using a tiny bit of dynamic res scaling to hold that lock 90. Now, to be clear, I'm very happy that the game has a dynamic resolution scaler. It's just very frustrating that it's not optional. They should have a separated minimum frame rate setting that's a dynamic scaler, and then they should have a separate frame rate limiter that are not set to the same value. They should also allow a native resolution with an unlocked frame rate, which is currently not available in the game. Now, if I can figure out a way to do it in the config file, then maybe I'll do that in the future. But anyway, let's go ahead and test out 1440p. Now, there are some graphics that you might be like, why am I not testing the other graphic settings? Because the only graphic settings are shadow resolution high-low and texture resolution high or low. This GPU clearly has enough VRAM, right? You can see our memory usage is not hitting our 8 GB limit. We're a little over 7 GB. And I'm not getting these stutters that I saw on my GTX 1060 for passing up the VRAM limit. There are some stutters in the game, to be clear, but that's Unreal Engine 4 loading issues. Assets loading in Unreal Engine 4, oftentimes the first time you load an asset into a game causes a stutter. Anyway, and the shadow resolution, I mean, I can lower it and like it doesn't really do much here. We're already holding the 90 FPS pretty well without lowering that. So yeah, I don't really see a lot of point in doing that if you're playing at 1080p. All right, let's go ahead and move up to 1440p. But again, if I leave this frame rate target at 90 FPS, now you might be like, hey, look, we're running the game at 1440p, 90 FPS at max settings. Great, except that we actually aren't, guys. It's dynamic resolution scaling without telling you. Again, watch my video on that if you want a side-by-side to prove it. It really is. So once again, let's play around with this and try to figure out what can the GPU actually do. So like at 30 FPS, for example, you can see that our GPU usage is only down in the 30% range. So we can definitely do better than 30 FPS at 1440p. That's not going to be an issue, at least in this scene. We're going to try out a few other scenes once we kind of dial it in. So there's no point staying at 30. So we'll try 1440p 60 FPS. Now you can see that our GPU usage looks like it spiked up to around 90 for a bit there, but now we're hanging out more around in the 70s and 80s. So it looks like at least in this scene, this is most likely a native 1440p 60 FPS. And I think the scene that had the train back near the beginning was one of the more demanding scenes in this opening area of the game, and I'm curious if it feels like we actually hold a native resolution in this scene. As I get down over here, this tends to be one of the more demanding things. See, our GPU usage is jumping up close to 90 FPS, so right here, when we're kind of in this mid-90 FPS range, mid 90%, upper 90% GPU usage, it's possible that we're seeing a slight dynamic res scale happen here in order to hold the 60 FPS cap, but it's not very aggressive. So I think that 60 FPS here is going to be mostly manageable at a native resolution with in more demanding areas like this one due to, I guess, whatever lighting and, you know, this train and all that is happening here. I think it's possible that we're seeing a small dynamic res scale in order to lock that 60. But I really think that this is going to be the way to go. And there's not much point lowering the textures. That won't really gain you any performance at all as long as you have enough VRAM. And I think we do have enough VRAM, and lowering the shadow resolution doesn't really change a whole heck of a lot. The only other thing you have here is characters displayed on screen, which might matter in a city section where there's more characters. I haven't made it to that point to test it out. Okay, so we could also try out 90 FPS, but you can see here, like I could definitely instantly tell that we lost some sharpness to the image. It's absolutely having to res scale to try to hit 90 FPS. And you can see that it's actually only in this area, not even quite hitting that 90 FPS target. So it's dynamic res scaling as low as it's willing to go. Now, it's not an unlimited resolution scale. I'm not quite sure what the percentage limit it does. Like it is limiting itself to not fully res scale down as low as needed to hit 90, so there is some kind of cap to that, and I'm not sure what that cap is. Because you can see here that it's going as low as it's willing to go, but it's not actually hitting that 90 FPS target. Which means that there's going to be no point setting it to 120, because I think it's going to continue to stay at this mid 80 FPS range in this scene because it's already working as hard, like it's going as low as it's willing to go. Okay? So I think that what we've just proved here is that your optimized settings for 1440p are going to be 60 FPS if you want it to actually be for the most part, native 1440p with maybe a few small dynamic res scales that aren't really noticeable. But if you want a smoother experience, you can certainly choose 90 FPS, and it looks like it would mostly hold 90 FPS, but with a lot more aggressive resolution scaling, so it's not really 1440p anymore. Let's go ahead and see if we can get into some combat at these settings and see what happens. So I think these are my optimized 1440p settings on this card, but I do want to explore them a little bit more. Maybe see what they do in the next area here. Again, look at our GPU usage here. I could tell the image slightly softened here. It's very hard to notice, so it still looks very good. But I think there's a small dynamic res scale happening here to hold that 60 FPS.
We've got company.
And again, to be clear, I'm very happy that we have dynamic res scaling this game. I think it's fantastic and it looks great. I just think it needs to be optional. You need to be able to select a native resolution with an unlocked frame rate. It's ridiculous that we can't. No, I will say these settings in combat look and feel good, although we can tell, based on the GPU usage, that I'm fairly certain some small res scales are happening here to hold that locked 60. Although it looks and feels good, so I that's good news. The last thing I want to test out here is 4K, but I know it's not going to actually be 4K. It's going to res scale to try to do 4K. So let's go ahead and try it out. So it looks like it's definitely res scaling. I played this game on my 6800 XT at native 4K, and I can definitely see the difference, although this looks very good on my 4K screen. We can see that it's not able to lock in 60 FPS, though, with maxed out settings, which is what we're currently running. I'm curious here. So we have a scene right here where we're close to 60 FPS, but it's not willing to dynamically scale low enough to hold 60 FPS. So I'm curious here if setting the shadow resolution to low will be enough to gain us a locked 60. Looks like it got us to 59. 58, 59, okay. So let's see how it does in combat. Yeah, so it's not quite a locked 60 with the shadows on low. But like I said, this does look quite good on my 4K screen, although I can certainly tell that this is res scaling. Although I'm pretty sure the res it's scaling down to is better than 1440p. So it won't go as low as 1440p because this looks sharper than 1440p did when I was playing at that, and it's also not performing as well as 1440p did. So I'm not sure again exactly what the dynamic res scale is, but it's certainly holding a higher resolution than 1440p when you set it to 4K. And like I said, it does look like with the shadows set to low, we're able to mostly stay at 60 FPS, but as we see, there's a few occasional drops down into the mid-50s. And there would be no point trying to target higher than 60 FPS at 4K because it's already struggling to hit 60 FPS here.
But I hear they make good guard dogs too.
See, we see a few little drops below 60 in the cutscene.
So how do we get to the bridge above Mako's storage?
All right, and I don't think there's any reason to lower the textures because we can tell by the memory usage that I'm pretty sure we're not going over the 8 gigabytes that the card has available to it, even here at 4K, especially with the shadows on low, because that does save us a little bit of VRAM usage. There's a few stutters every now and then you can see on my frame time graph, but I'm pretty sure that's just loading in new assets on Unreal Engine, and it's not a VRAM stutter. Those would be more repeatable.
Damn, I'm good.
All right, so my overall thoughts here are that the game is looking and running very good, but it's literally just the PS5 game running on a PC. And it runs well, but they didn't even bother to do virtually any of the normal PC graphics settings. which we know that Square Enix has done on some of their other Final Fantasy titles, which is very frustrating to see. But performance on the 6600 is fantastic at 1080p, 1440p, and even quite playable and looking pretty nice on a 4K screen, although it's clearly res scaling. I hope you all have an excellent day.